Hey, what's up guys? JB here, and I'm back again with another entry in my Versus series. Now I did a video a couple of weeks back looking at Ranon and Ibarra. It was very well received, so the opportunity is lining up perfectly with another pair of units here. And this time we're going to be looking at two light evade units, one of which I think most of us are very familiar with, and that's Elena here. You know, we just had a run of these Global Fest units where she was included, of course, and I think there may even be another crack at her coming up with the confirmed new global exclusive unit that we'll be receiving very soon. On the other hand, if we follow the Japanese side, as we tend to do, on the short horizon, we'll be seeing within the next couple of weeks the Persona 5 collaboration, and potentially looking at pulling for Violet here as well. I think the situation though for a lot of us is we already have Elena, and we just got Locke during the Final Fantasy VI collaboration for free, who pairs perfectly with her. So you might be asking yourself at this point, do you really even need another light evade unit? And that's really the thought that I wanted to dive in and explore in today's video. So let's compare their kits top to bottom to truly see which limited light evade waifu reigns supreme. Let's dive in. And as we always do, let's start with their stats. Now in terms of agility, Violet actually has a significant 7 base agility advantage. However, in a practical build, including agility cards, and most importantly using Elena's agility passive, they're more or less on equal footing. You know, Elena actually even has a small advantage, before going into a game. However, once you actually get in-game and you factor in, a 20% agility buff, like from a TMR or an active ability, maybe even throw some affinity bonuses in there as well. And Violet is actually going to start pulling ahead in that situation, just by the slimmest of margins there. So I'd say, in an actual in-game scenario, they're more or less even, when it comes to agility. Now next up we're going to look at their actual luck values, and when we're looking at the innate totals on WoTV, Violet does have a small advantage here. We're looking at 280 versus 272. However, in this category, it's actually Elena that has the base advantage when we're talking about luck. She's actually getting less of a boost when we're actually looking at the individual board nodes. And the reason why that's important is that any percentage boost when we're talking about vision cards or in-game buffs or anything like that is only applied to your base stat value. And I've broken all those values down, including what they would be buffed up in-game, and I'll bring that up here on the screen. So you can see that in that regard, they're actually on pretty close footing here as well, just within a couple of luck within each other, even in a practical in-game scenario. So again, remarkably close here when it comes to both of the main evade stats. Now we can also see here that Violet has 5 flat evade, and this is coming from her mastery ability. And when we actually get into the battle, we'll look more at the innate evade totals, but just something that I wanted to point out here. In terms of dexterity, Violet also has an edge on this front, and they both have a nice starting crit value as well. So both of these units actually are going to have a pretty decent innate crit opportunity. But when you're considering passives and also active abilities, Violet definitely can become a crit machine, something that's kind of a calling card for her, I'd say. Now Elena, on the other hand, has a small advantage when it comes to innate tankiness. She has that small edge in hit points and better resistances to both missile and magic. And those are 2 of the 3 most prevalent when it comes to guaranteed hits in War of the Visions. I will note though that Violet has that edge on slash resistance at 10% versus Elena, who's neutral in that category. But Violet's best resistance is actually her strike damage resistance at 15%. And this is certainly an interesting footnote, if we start seeing units in the future specializing in this damage type, but definitely not the most relevant or useful resist to have right now. Otherwise though, remarkably similar stat pools for both of these units. And I don't think that I can say whether either unit is really distinguishing themselves in a huge way from each other, just looking at these alone. So let's actually start the battle and we'll see, who comes out on top. Here's round 1, and we're going to be talking about damage. And in terms of the primary damage stat, their totals are actually identical at 570. If we're splitting hairs though, Elena's base is slightly ahead, but not enough to really make a tangible difference, I'd say, so I'm calling this one even. Now in terms of access to different damage types, they both have access to 2. Violet has slash and missile, while Elena has slash and magic attacks. So again, I'm calling this one even here. So now we're going to get to the point where we actually see some differences here, and starting with accuracy. Now keep in mind these calculations are their base accuracy, including any passives that they have. And Elena of course has her Sharp Mind passive. and I consider that really an always on because it's tied to her spirit penetration, and she pulls ahead here by an innate 14% accuracy. And again, as we noted, Elena's base luck value is a little bit better as well. So I think this puts her in a much better position, especially when it comes to evade mirror matches, which I think we're going to be seeing plenty of out there now that everybody got lock for free. Now moving into their damage modifiers, and on their main abilities, again, I leave limit breaks out of this consideration, because everybody generally has that standard 200% there. But Elena gets a clear win here again. She has her Crystal Shine Bright ability with a 200% modifier. She also has Earthrending Pain in her Kododama sub for a 205% magic attack as well. Violet, on the other hand, is topping out at 175. Not terrible by any means, but definitely a step down from Elena. Moving into Imperils. Now, technically, Elena does have a 38% light imperil that she has access to, and that's in her Rune Knight sub. However, I leave this category even, as that's a short-range TP-based ability that rarely, if ever, sees any use in the game, in my opinion. But it's definitely an interesting footnote, and it's there, if you wanted to use it. Now, what about damage penetrations? And here they both get access to that standard 40% to defense or spirit, respectively. However, Elena really differentiates herself when it comes to slash resistance penetration. She gets 40% in her Champions of Estrella passive. She also has an active ability from her Rune Knight sub that can get her up to a whopping 80% if she needs it. Violet, on the other hand, doesn't have any passives for slash resist penetration. She does, though, have access to a counter ability, which can get her up to 30%. Now, the problem with this is that it does require that counter to go off, obviously, for her to get access to it, but the counter does require her to evade an attack in order for it to take effect. So if she's not being targeted in the battle, she's going to have 0% slash penetration innately. So Elena having that reliable 40% starting value definitely gets the win here as well. Now, what about attack range? Now, Violet here can actually get up to 8 range with her gunner attacks if she uses her gunner passive as well as the aimed fire active ability. However, I don't really consider that a practical PvP build, as it does lower her evasion by 5 by equipping that gunner passive. So in that case, she'd be looking at 6 range with her base gunner skills and the active buff, still giving her a nice edge there though. Alright, last category here, and that's guaranteed hits. And Elena gets one with her Kododama sub. She has Unevadable Pain. However, I don't really consider this one a major advantage. This one does have a cast time on it, and the modifier is not all that amazing either. And both of these units are actually going to have very nice accuracy in an in-game build, so it's questionable whether you even need it, but still definitely a nice option to have nonetheless. So considering all of these factors, the damage round definitely goes to Elena. Alright, round 2, and this is the utility round. Now, neither of these units have access to a barrier break. However, I do note an asterisk here in that they both have chaining abilities, which, while not as good, damage-wise for that particular attack, will effectively remove most barriers for any follow-up attacks. So it can be almost as good, in some circumstances. In terms of counter reduction, Elena actually has 2 different abilities that can shut off enemy counters, one of which is area of effect, which is very nice. So clear advantage here for Elena. However, with the new mechanic of reaction block percentage that's been introduced to the game, I'd say the significance of these type of attacks is going down a little bit, but I'd say it's definitely preferred to have that reliable 100% chance to shut them off like Elena has. A couple of other differentiation points here. Violet has an area of effect AP break. It removes 15 AP from the targets in a large diamond AoE. Now, that doesn't sound incredible on its own, but paired with Locke, who has similar capabilities in his kit, it's actually extremely strong and definitely a reason that you'd strategize and run these 2 units together. Elena, on the other hand, has a 20% agility break. I think most of us have experienced how powerful that can be by now in game. It just gives her more opportunities to chain up, even with herself sometimes. Alright, last 2 points here. And what about defense and spirit breaks? Now, Violet has access to a 25 defense break. Elena, on the other hand, doesn't have a spirit break in her kit. She relies on her teammates for that, so definitely a nice advantage here for Violet in this category. Next one here is active modifier boosts that they have in their kits. And Violet has a small edge here as well. She has a 35 light attack buff in her kit, as well as a 25 crit damage up buff. whereas Elena only has a 25 light attack buff available to her. Overall here, this is a very close round and tough to call. I think though from a utility angle, Violet definitely has a small advantage here, especially when you're considering maybe a physically focused damage party with that defense break. So round 2, I'm going to give to Violet. Alright, round 3 is up next, and we're going to be talking about support, both from a self and a team perspective. So first 2 points here, I actually have them on similar footing. You know, they both have a 25 evade active buff that they can apply to themselves. They both also have ways to decrease the opponent's accuracy. Violet's is a little bit more reliable though, in that it's on one of her sub-job attacks. And she does also have a counter ability that can do that as well. I don't envision that one's actually seeing much use though, as she really wants to have that slash res pen that we talked about earlier. On the other hand, Elena has a more potent accuracy debuff with her anti-evil counter ability. So unless we're talking manual PvP, I consider this category more or less a wash. Okay, so moving on, what about CT related effects? Now, one of the most interesting things about Violet is that she has a party buff that increases your CT by 15 if your attack crits. Now, this ability is quite incredible in my opinion. And as a side note, I think it offers a nice synergy angle between these 2 units here. Now, you can think about Elena coming in and dropping her agility break while also getting that 15 CT at the same time. You know, Violet can then follow up, crit herself, also get 15 CT. So those 2 effects stacked together, the agility break combined with the CT up, is hugely powerful. You know, it just makes it that much easier to pull off double turns and get that increased chain damage. It's just going to absolutely melt tanks or really any units out there if you're able to pull that off. So I do really like the interaction there quite a bit, and it's definitely one of the key parts about Violet's kit in my opinion. Now, Violet has another nice option within her Duelist sub, and that's a party area of effect resistance buff as well, whereas Elena has access to a self-only area of resistance buff. I think though that Violet has more important buffs to get online, so I think this one is more of a nice to have or situational, but I do give her the edge in that category. Alright, last 3 items here, and I'm giving them all to Elena. She has access to a self-agility buff. She also has a party-based attack and magic buff. Lastly, she has access to a 50% magical barrier from her Kododama sub. Definitely a nice option there, but not something that the AI will actually use unless you're really turning off pretty much everything in her kit. Now, a couple other things to note here. They both have access to Immortal Spirit, hugely powerful, especially on an evade unit. They both have access to mobility buffs as well. So definitely a very close round here again, but I'm going to give this round to Elena. Alright, so that leads us to our final round, and that's X Factors. And first thing we're going to look at is chaining ability. And Violet has very nice capability in this regard. You know, she has chaining potential up to 3 hits. Unfortunately though, she's pitted up against Elena here, who is definitely the top dog in my book when we're talking about chaining. You know, notably, Elena has that 4-hit chain on her Iridescent Blade, which can be absolutely devastating in both PvE and PvP alike. So we talked a little bit earlier about evasion, but what is their actual starting evade when you're also considering their passives? And here Violet has a small edge. You can see here 80% versus 77%. Let me pull up my evade index here. And units I have marked within this index with evade in parentheses means that their build is using double passives, while everyone else is generally using 1. But you can see this is very, very close here. And both units are among the top end, you know, when it comes to innate evade capability. I'm calling this category even though, just because of that base luck factor that we talked a little bit about earlier. And I think what you'll actually find in an actual in-game environment, that they're more or less even. Nice starting value though for both of these units. You know, they're both among the top 10 to 15 in the game. Alright, another X factor here, and that's starting AP value. And Elena, when you compare her against maybe a mage who has 75% starting AP, her 50% doesn't quite seem as good there. But when compared against a physical damage based unit like Violet here, it's a big advantage. Now that means right out of the gate, Elena could start doing her thing, whereas Violet needs a ramp up turn to sort of bank up some AP before she can get started. And that's something that we definitely get, you know, in most PvP scenarios. But in some PvE events, especially if you're on a turn count, having that banked starting AP is a big advantage and can have potential impact on the final damage tallies. In terms of their TMRs, you know, Violet's TMR gives a hate down effect as well as 20 AP to the caster, and it has a single cast. Hate down can definitely be interesting in some auto scenarios, but I'm not really crazy about this TMR if I'm being honest. Elena's, on the other hand, is quite a bit better in my opinion. It provides 2 casts of a 20 resistance buff to both dark and light, while also buffing your own slash attack. I think this just has a lot more use cases and relevance, especially when considering modes like Guild War. so I'm giving the TMR category to Elena. What about mobility though? And here Violet has a clear win. She has 4-2 move innately, whereas Elena gets a basic 3-1 movement. However, they both do have access to a mobility up buff in their kit, so neither are really hurting too badly when it comes to mobility, and it's actually one of Violet's best strengths, because she can get up to 5-2 movement after that buff is considered, and she gets the win when it comes to this category. Okay, so maybe a couple interesting ones here, and the next one I'm going to look at is headwear. And you know, they both actually wear cloth armor, while Violet can wear hats and Elena can wear helms. And I'm going to give Elena the edge here under one condition, and that's you have access to Kane's TMR. I think this TMR is absolutely broken on Elena. She's such an insanely fast unit that being able to throw haste on top of that can be just nutty. If you don't have access to Kane's TMR though, I think I would swing it back the other way to Violet, and that's because she would have access to both Locke and Luel's TMR. Both very nice evade-focused party buffs. Another note that I have here is their costs, and if you're in the bucket of people that's considering pulling for either of these units, you have to consider that, and it definitely makes Violet a lot more attractive being that 90 cost. She's going to have the standard pull rate, whereas Elena has that reduced 100 cost pull rate. So if you're on a Visior budget, you know, that's something that you definitely need to look at. Alright, my last note here is their limit breaks. You know, Violet here has a decent enough limit break. It's really only damage focused though. It's not really bringing any effects along with it. Elena's, on the other hand, is a very impactful limit break, not only in that it's an area of effect limit break, whereas Violet's is single target, it's that Elena's also brings 2 effects along with it. One is that reduced counter chance, and then also it brings a 20% agility break that we talked a little bit about earlier. So in that regard, Elena definitely has a much more impactful limit break. Alright, so that's the X Factors round, and totaling up and considering all these points, I think Elena wins this one handily. Alright, so the battle of Violet versus Elena is complete, but who's coming out on top? And in my view, it's clearly Elena here. Now don't take that to mean that I think Violet is a bad unit by any means. I actually think she's a very nice unit. She offers great synergy opportunities with both Locke and Elena. However, I think what the choice actually comes down to is, do you actually need another light evade unit after we just got Locke? And this is the interesting position that we're in as global players. You know, JP didn't have this dilemma. You know, they didn't have Elena when Violet was introduced to the game. So I think it was maybe more of a no-brainer for them to pull Violet and pair her with Locke. And you know, Violet has a lot of great uses in both PvP and PvE. You know, she's no slouch, you know, when it comes to chaining. But for global players, I think Violet is going to be a luxury item, especially when we know that there are future counters coming into the meta who perform very well against her. Units like Astoria, Joker, and Dark Leela, for example. Now, obviously, if Violet were to get some global buffs, you know, either to her kit or to her vision card, and I do think that that will happen, it could shift the conversation here just a little bit, but I do believe it would need to be a major buff for this conversation we've had here today to change significantly. And with how long Light has been a top meta pick, I think it would be a really bad and short-sighted decision for Gumi to really go overboard with buffing Violet, and I hope by now that they know better, but we'll see what happens. So what are you guys thinking out there? Any big points that you think that I missed or overlooked between these two units? Definitely let me know in the comments down below. And after we've had this discussion, you know, what are your pull plans going to be? Definitely let me know about that too. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, help us grow and be notified of my future videos. And that's really all I have to say for today. So as always, stay safe out there, and I'll see you guys in the next one.